Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner again, and I'm coming to you today from in front of the pagoda high atop Mount Penn overlooking beautiful Reading, Pennsylvania. Why would I be coming to you from the pagoda today? Well, because today we're going to take a look at a famous poet in American literature who happens to be from Reading, Pennsylvania. His name is Wallace Stevens. And he's an interesting kind of guy as a poet because while his poetry was purely modernist poetry and he gets great respect for his work, he was personal friends with Robert Frost, he wasn't a poet first and foremost. In fact, he worked in the insurance industry most of his life. He walked to work, even though he had a car and did quite well for himself. He walked to work, he walked home, worked in the insurance industry. And at the same time, he was writing award-winning poetry. Many of the people he worked with didn't even know that he was a poet because he kept his daily contact with life, as he called it, through his work, separate from his poetry. He almost lived two lives. But let's take a look at what he wrote and let's get started. We're going to take a look at two poems today from Wallace Stevens. Our question is going to be, like always, what's the historical significance of Wallace Stevens' poetry? And for the most part, we're going to be looking at what he did with language and poetic style. He's a modernist poet, and remember, one of the concepts of the modernist era, is make everything new. Just make it new again. Experiment, try new things. So we'll be looking at how he does that. The first piece is called "The Snowman." And it sounds like it's probably a Christmas piece, you know, he came to life one day, but no, it's nothing like that. So I don't want to spoil too much till we get to the poem. And the second one is 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And this is a poem really about perspective, because we can all look at the same thing and yet each see something differently. And in this particular poem, it's 13 different ways of looking at the same thing. There's a relatively young Wallace Stevens in that picture. He's born in 1879, lives till 1955. That's still before my time. That's the time of Happy Days, if you've ever watched that old show. And I explained, you know, before we started in here, that he maintained contact with everyday life through a job. He thought that was really important. And I have a quote at the top here. I prefer to think I'm just a man, not a poet part-time, a businessman the rest. I don't divide my life, I go on living. And that's an interesting philosophy to keep in mind as we take a look at the poetry. So he was born and raised in Reading, Pennsylvania. And Reading, Pennsylvania was once one of the places to live, believe it or not. There was a time in the early 1800s where Reading was the country's most populous inland city. And of course, if you've ever played Monopoly, you know that the Reading Railroad features prominently in Monopoly. And there was a good deal of wealth in Reading because of a company called the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, which was both railroads and coal. But Wallace Stevens was raised in Reading, well-educated. He struggled at Harvard. He went there, but he still got into Harvard, and that's pretty good for most people. He was there 3 years, and then he became an attorney. So when it says he was admitted to the bar in 1904, the bar is the organization of attorneys that, you know, attorneys sort of certify other attorneys. And so he became an attorney. And when you are a lawyer, insurance companies like to have you on their side. And he ended up spending most of his life working in the insurance industry. He worked for the Hartford Insurance Company, which is out of, I bet you can't guess the name of the city. Yep, Hartford, Connecticut. Moved there in 1916. And as I said, he sort of lived a double life. You know, he was writing poetry and he was famous and he was winning awards and things. And yet many of the people he worked with in the insurance industry had no idea that he was writing poetry. One of the things about him that's interesting is we're going to have a lot of poets in this unit, especially like John Dos Passos or William Carlos Williams, who were tied in with some social causes, often related to things like the Great Depression and the economy. Wallace Stevens kept himself out of all of that. And his poems are pretty much about observations and seeing things in a new way. and sometimes seeing things in a way other than the way other people see them. I told you, even though he had money, had a car, he walked to work every day, just thought that was kind of important. And from what I understand, it was a pretty good walk too. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for his poetry in 1954. And he won the National Book Award that same year. And so the National Book Award obviously is given to a book of poetry in his particular case. There's a picture of an older Wallace Stevens there on the left side of your screen, and he's with Robert Frost on the right. Wallace Stevens is the taller man. Robert Frost is the smaller man. I did not intend for that to rhyme like that. And there's that quote I was referring to at the top. It gives a man character as a poet to have this daily contact with a job. He believed that, perhaps if all he did was sit around and just write poetry, he might lose his contact with the people who were going to be reading his poetry. Now, two views. Not everybody likes everything. And sometimes, if we think back to, for example, when Walt Whitman started writing poetry, if you remember in that unit, I told you that many of the critics of his day didn't understand what he was doing. He was using free verse, and he wasn't following any metrical structures or rhyme schemes. And they're like, what is this? This is not poetry. Until Ralph Waldo Emerson spoke up and defended him for doing something new. If we take a look, just two kind of interpretations of the poems here. The first one says Stevens' poems are sometimes difficult to understand because he sees more than we thought there was to see. I kind of understand that as a compliment. That's what I want artists to do. I don't want artists to show me what I already know. I want artists to help me grow as a person. I want them to help me see more deeply into the human condition and understand others. And here it says Stevens' poems help us realize there's more to see than what we see. So I see that as a compliment. But I see this other one as derogatory. It's sort of an insult. From one end of the book to the other, there is not an idea that can vitally affect the mind. There is not a word that can arouse emotion. And I read that and I'm like, ooh, that's a terrible insult. Like your poetry does not even bring up feelings in me as I read it. But there are others who say that's exactly what Wallace Stevens was going for, that he wanted to describe things, but he wanted to do it without the implication that there must always be feeling associated with that. Now, we're only going to take a look at two of his poems, and I'll full disclosure here, I find Wallace Stevens to be a difficult poet. And perhaps it's because he doesn't feed me this emotion. He lets it up to me, and I don't feel emotion, and I feel like I'm doing this wrong because I'm not feeling emotion. But I may be doing it right, and maybe he's doing it right, if the goal was the idea to not have an idea that can affect the mind or arouse emotion, right? Poetry's poetry, right? I'm not gonna, poetry is in the eye of the beholder in my book. And you may find a poet that you absolutely connect with, and some critics may despise that poet or vice versa, right? So let's take a look here. Alrighty, so if we were together in class, we'd talk about the Reader's Journal, and the question we're given here is, what feelings do spring, summer, fall, winter, what do they evoke in you? We all have this idea of our favorite season, and in my case, I like parts of almost every season. Winter's kind of cool, get that first snow, but then I quickly tire of winter. Summer's pretty cool, but by the end of summer, it always feels like everything's all overgrown, and I just wait for autumn. The beginning of autumn is cool, like spring. Then I love the changing of the leaves, but the end of autumn is kind of dark and dreary, and there are cold winds and rain, and so I have feelings associated with each of them. But are the feelings in me, or do they come to me from that, that season? And when we take a look at the snowman, you want to look at the idea of feelings and season and the snowman. Now, the literary tools are going to tie in here, and I have a brand new literary tool. There's one today that I think you've probably never heard before, and it's called pathetic fallacy. Now, we did some work with our Friday essays, and I wanted you to take a look at what we called logical fallacies. A fallacy is a belief that people hold that is not accurate. People just kind of hold on to it and they don't question it. Now, pathetic sounds, like, oh, it's very sad. She's so pathetic. She lost her job or something like that. But the word pathetic comes from pathos, which means emotion. And so we might think of this as an emotional fallacy or wrongly assuming emotion where it doesn't exist. And in literature, I know you know what personification is. Personification is when we give human characteristics to non-human or even inanimate things. Pathetic fallacy is sort of like that, except that it's specific to when we give human emotion to things that have no emotion. Robin Lamb here has this little thing, in its extremity on the farthest hill, the willow weeps alone. And we know there is a tree, we call it the weeping willow, because the leaves and the branches hang down and it looks sad. It looks like it's crying. And so we call it a weeping willow. But the truth is, it's a tree. It doesn't have emotion. Humans have emotions. And maybe looking at that tree causes emotions in me, which I then project on that tree. And if I do this in literature, that's called pathetic fallacy. All right, so here's the poem, The Snowman. We'll read this one together. And then if you go into Schoology, you'll find that I've given you a link where you can hear Wallace Stevens reading his own poetry. And I always recommend hearing the poet read his or her own poetry. So here's how this one goes. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. For the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. All right, now one thing about a Wallace Stevens poem is you don't read it once and own it. And you can read it again and again and see something new each time. And if you read it in a few years, you'll probably see it a little bit differently. But it starts off, one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice. Okay, this is all fine, right? So someone who thinks of winter, who knows what it's like to be cold, who's seen these pine trees in the snow. Junipers are another type of evergreen, covered in ice. A January sun so far off and it doesn't warm you. If you're that kind of person, it would be hard not to think of the misery and the sound of the wind. I mean, when we talk about the howling wind, it sounds sad, but the wind, there's nothing sad about the wind. It is just moving air which creates sound, and human beings then attribute that human emotion, the sadness in the wind. It's pathetic fallacy, right? But then the listener, see, you notice that the poem doesn't use the word snowman anywhere. You have to get it from the title. The snowman would be the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself. He is nothing. He is just snow. He doesn't have a mind. He doesn't have emotion. He doesn't judge. But that snowman, who is nothing himself, beholds or sees or experiences nothing that is not there. Okay? And the nothing that is there. A bit of a conundrum there, all right? All right, let's check for understanding. Again, poetry and multiple choice, true and false questions, not good, not good. I would much rather have you read a poem and then talk to me about the poem, but the textbook gives us these for a quick check for understanding, so let's do it. What is a pathetic fallacy? That was just simply the literary term. So which one of these best defines a pathetic fallacy? Got it? You got it? You're sure you know what it is? All right, it's C. It's the tendency to attribute human emotions to non-human things, and particularly things in the natural world. It's still a pathetic fallacy if you look at a car And you notice that the grill makes it look kind of smiling, and you describe it as being, a happy car or something like that. But generally, it has to do with things in the natural world. How about number 2? I've got to move my picture out of the way because I can't read the whole sentence. There we go. Which statement best describes how Wallace Stevens addresses the concept of pathetic fallacy in the snowman? So we have A, the poet incorrectly refers to the listener, a character from a famous poem. B, the poet describes a winter world of loneliness and misery that is not acknowledged by the things in nature, only by humans. Do I even need to go on here? Do I even need to do anything else? No, that's it right there. A snowman doesn't think, a snowman doesn't feel, and yet in this case, the snowman doesn't notice the things that are there or the things that aren't there because the snowman isn't really there. All right, second poem. This one's longer. All right, this is 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And the question we have here is when you think of blackbirds, what images come to mind? And first of all, I would say, if you were in class, when was the last time you thought of blackbirds? I don't find myself like I finish breakfast and before I put away the milk, I suddenly think of blackbirds. But the point here with the question is, when we think of things in nature, images come to mind. But there may be much more than what we're seeing. Other people may see it differently, and we can train ourselves to see more. We can see what's there, and like that listener in the snow, we can see what's not there. So let's take a look at 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. But first, the literary terms. Images are so important to Wallace Stevens. You've got to see these poems in your head as you're reading them. So as we're looking at the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, looking at blackbirds, you got to see them in your head, all right? So that's imagery. And then we have this idea of abstract imagery versus concrete. So things that are concrete, you can hold in your hand, you can touch them, you can hear them, you can taste them, you can smell them, they're really there. Things that are abstract are more like concepts, all right? So anger is abstract, right? You cannot touch anger, it's not really there. Doubt, well, any emotion is really abstract here. So examples that they've given you, freedom, power, dignity, they're all very abstract. We can represent them in concrete things. We do that all the time. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, we call it the Liberty Bell because it's our symbol of freedom. So the Liberty Bell itself is very concrete, but the concept that it represents is abstract. All right, so here's the poem. And hopefully you understand Roman numerals, but each of the stanzas, there are going to be 13 of them, right? That's the 13 different ways of looking at a blackbird, are going to be in Roman numerals. And maybe I will read them. I'll read the Roman numerals as we go too. 1, among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2, I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3, the blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4, a man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5, I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6, icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7, O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8, I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know too that the blackbird is involved in what I know. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 9, When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of the blackbirds flying in a green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him. In that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. And 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs. All right, this is another poem that you cannot own upon a first reading. You'll notice some techniques. There was repetition of certain lines, but each one of the stanzas is a different way of looking at blackbirds. And there's still this idea of some pathetic fallacy in here. You know, if you take something like a man and a woman are one. Well, they always say when people get married, two become one, right? A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one, because the blackbird is not human. And again, whether or not you believe a blackbird, can think, whether or not it has its own sense of self and personality, in this particular case, it doesn't add something else. All right, let's take a look at the questions. And as I said, questions with correct answers to go with a poem like this that is so abstract are almost unfair. Oh, look at that. Must be a mistake there. They all showed up ahead of time. So you can take these. I don't know why that happened, but it's too late to fix it. In stanza 3, the speaker explains that the blackbird stands outside the pantomime, and that is false. It's part of the pantomime. And first of all, these questions about in stanza this, in stanza that, nobody would be trying to trick you and pick a wrong one, like, oh no, that was in 6, not in 3. These are just to check to see that you made it all the way through the poem. In stanza 4, the speaker explains a man and a woman and a blackbird are one, and that's absolutely true. The blackbird does not add a third. 3, the speaker addresses the men in a small town near London, England. No, it is men of Haddam. Number 4, the speaker believes that the blackbird is involved in what he knows, and that's absolutely true. And number 5, the speaker claims that it was dark all afternoon because of clouds that brought snow. And it does not say because of clouds that brought snow, but it says it was dark all afternoon. It was nighttime all afternoon, because in the wintertime that happens when these winter storms come in. All right, so that is Wallace Stevens. He is not an easy poet to get to know the first time around, but I promise you, if you sit down and read some Wallace Stevens poetry and have some friends with you and you start discussing it, it's going to be an excellent conversation. And maybe you could bring your Wallace Stevens poetry right up here to the top of Mount Penn and sit by the pagoda and look out at his hometown as you do it. If you stayed with me through the end, I thank you, and we'll wave with this hand so I can be over there on the other side. I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Be safe.